Hobson's Bay is the northernmost reach of Port Phillip Bay, the inlet on which the city of Melbourne is situated. Named after Captain William Hobson, an early explorer, the River Yarra spills into the sea here, and ships would anchor in these waters in the early days of the colony. In April of 1852, one such ship was a barque built in 1844, named the Nelson, under the command of Walter Wright. The ship was lying in the harbour ready to leave for London with a handsome cargo of gold, which had been loaded at Geelong. In 1851, gold was discovered at Ballarat. By 1852 it was considered the world's richest alluvial goldfield, with thousands of miners arriving every week in the hope of making a quick fortune. A group of men, at least 9, but said to be up to 22 in number, hoped to make a quick fortune, but they did not buy picks and shovels and head up country. They gathered weapons and, like buccaneers of old, made for the Nelson. The gang had planned their raid carefully, although it was believed another ship, the Admiral, which had just departed for London, also with gold on board, may have been the original target. At 2 o'clock in the morning they stole 2 rowboats to row out to the Nelson with muffled oars, getting close enough to observe the movements of those on board. There was no watch set, even after the gold had been loaded aboard. The captain was not aboard that night. The chief officer, Henry John Mollett Draper, had entertained the second mate of the Royal George, who remained sleeping there, and the chief officer of another ship, the Hooghly, a man named Paddle, drinking, singing and playing cards until about 10 p.m, when Paddle returned to his own ship. Draper went to bed about 11 p.m. Using a rope, the stealthy pirates climbed quickly and silently aboard the ship. Once their presence was noticed, a seaman went to the chief officer's cabin and informed Henry Draper that there were robbers on board. Draper went on to the quarter-deck to see for himself what was happening, and was confronted by a group of men disguised with black handkerchiefs over the lower part of their faces, who levelled pistols at him. One of the gang announced, "We have come for the gold, and the gold we'll have, or blow your brains out." Draper, not unreasonably, asked to be allowed to return to his cabin and put his trousers on. He was allowed to go, but under escort. The man stood watch with a pistol trained on Draper as he dressed. Before he had finished, 2 others entered the cabin to hurry him up. "Come along, we've not come here to be played with." Draper was moved from his cabin back to the deck, and forced to stand next to the capstan. He observed 8 or 10 men at this time. Draper was again threatened with having a hole shot through him, this time if he didn't show the pirates where the lazarette was. He walked to the cabin and found Davis, the second mate of the Royal George, lying guarded on the sofa. 6 or 8 of the robbers, all armed, filled the room. One had a revolving pistol, one holding a blunderbuss, and another armed with a sword. Again threatened, Draper pointed where the entrance to the lazarette was, and one of the men removed the hatch. Draper was told to go down, and upon hesitating, was pricked in the side by one of the gang with his sword. One of the men went down first, and Draper followed. The robber held his pistol on Draper, as the officer pointed out to the locker which held the gold. A bayonet was passed down, and the pirate prized open the lid. Deliriously he exclaimed, "Oh my God, here's diggings! This is the best diggings I ever was at!" When asked to help remove the gold, Draper refused, so another robber came down and the pair began to remove the precious metal. Meanwhile, nerves had gotten to one of the gang upstairs, who began to cry. One of his mates struck him on the arm or the ribs and rebuked him, saying, "Hold your tongue, you
Fool, what are you blubbering about?"
23 boxes of gold were taken. One of the pirates, wearing a straw hat and his face hidden by a coloured handkerchief, generously offered one of the boxes as a bribe to Draper, saying he had no reason to fear being detected. "I've lived honestly till now and shall have none of it," Draper replied. "Well, if you won't, we will have it," the pirate said, and passed the box up to join the rest on a table in the cabin. When Draper went back up, the carpenter, the butcher, a boy sailor named Jasmine, and 2 seamen were brought into the cabin, and their hands tied behind them with strips torn off the tablecloth and a shirt. The raiders then took the ship's arms from a chest as well. Draper too had his hands tied. Draper saw the men preparing to lower the quarter-boat, and pleaded with the robbers not to, as it would drift off and be lost. Ignoring him, they set the boat out. One of the gang, upset with Draper, pushed him back into the cabin. Muskets were thrown overboard into the sea, and other guns were broken down to make them inoperable. And then some of the men entered the captain's cabin. Fearful the chronometer might be damaged, and not to be intimidated, Draper asked, "Who was the captain of the gang?" The reply he received was, "We have none. We are all captains." At that point, Draper was grazed on the thigh when one of the pistols discharged. The man who fired said it was an accident. The crew were pushed down into the lazarette and the pirates departed. After about 10 minutes, Jasmine said his hands were somewhat free as he struggled with the bonds. The pirates had overlooked the cook, who came along calling, "Where are you?" Freed from the lazarette by the cook, they signalled the Hoogly, but by this time the pirates had rowed away out of sight and split up. The 2 rowboats were found the next morning abandoned, one on the beach at Williamstown and the other inland at St Kilda, where tracks showed a dray had been waiting to take the loot away. On the 3rd of April, a man walking near the beach discovered the boxes which had held the gold, smashed open, and the broken rifle used to open them, hidden under some tea trees. On Sunday afternoon, a man's body washed ashore at St Kilda. It was thought it could have been the corpse of one of the pirates, possibly the man who had shot Draper, or the one who had started crying. The man had died from being beaten. The forces of the law moved swiftly. On the night after the robbery, the Superintendent of Police traced a man named John George James to the Queen's Theatre, and brought Henry Draper, the first mate, face to face with him. Draper did not recognise him then. However, when James was arrested at Williamstown on the 6th of April 1852, Draper identified him as one of the pirates, and seemingly the ringleader. He said that James was the man who had jabbed him with the sword to force him along. The identification was backed up by Davis. A box, similar to those the gold was packed in, was found among James' possessions. James denied he was a runaway convict from Van Diemen's Land, present-day Tasmania, when first arrested, but eventually confessed that he was. His name there was William Johnson. He had once served as a policeman at Hamilton, near Hobart. At the same time, arrests were made in Geelong. Draper and Davis were asked by detectives to identify 4 men held there, believed to have been involved with the robbery. They identified 2 named James Morgan and James Duncan. William Barnes, a tall, thin man, was arrested with James Ball. Money they had on them causing suspicion. Another man arrested by Detective Fenning, named Davis, was employed on the Nelson up until a few days before the raid. He was not identified by Draper or his namesake. James Morgan, alias Gadigan, was identified by Chief Constable Carman as a runaway prisoner convicted of robbing a store some years earlier and sent to Norfolk Island. He had £34 and a pair of loaded pistols on him when searched. The trial of John James, James Morgan, James Duncan and John Roberts took place on the 21st and 22nd of May 1852 for having feloniously assaulted Henry Draper and having stolen 8,183 ounces of gold, valued at £24,000, as well as the boxes that held the gold, valued at £6, and 9 muskets and 9 cutlasses, all valued at £1 each. Empanelling a jury proved to be a lengthy process, due to so many challenges by the prisoners. The Attorney-General then expressed a need to try each man separately, whereupon the objections ceased, and 12 men sworn in. Henry Draper recounted the events of the night, and though not certain, said he thought John James was the man who had jabbed him with the sword, and that Duncan was the man who had hauled the gold up, and who had offered him a share of it. The candlelight had illuminated Duncan's face fully at the time. He thought he recognised Roberts as the man who threw the muskets overboard, but wasn't certain about Morgan being one of the pirates. William Henry Davis, of the Royal George, gave evidence that he had been disturbed from his sleep by some men who said they were having a lark. He told them to go away, but one of them pointed a pistol at him and said, "You are right enough, and this is no lark." Asked about the gold, he said Draper was the man to ask. Davis was tied up and guarded by one of the gang wearing a cabbage tree hat and a dark coat. Davis swore that the man who tied his hands was the defendant named Morgan. William Jasmine, one of the seamen, testified that he had seen 18 to 20 pirates roaming in the moonlight on the ship that night. He identified all but Morgan as having been there. The defence lawyer unctuously praised both the learned and fair judge and the unusually intelligent jury to help with a forlorn case. He then tried to insinuate that the boxes may not have held gold at all, before claiming that the identification of the men was questionable. Jasmin's evidence was in doubt, he claimed, because as a Belgian, and therefore a foreigner, Jasmin would have difficulty telling one Englishman apart from another. It was claimed that all the men were miles away from Hobson's Bay on the night of the 2nd of April. One of the men may well have been. Constable Everon of Kyneton claimed he had seen Duncan there on the 1st of April, and again on the morning of the 2nd. Kyneton is 50 or 60 miles away from Melbourne. At least 2 other witnesses confirmed Roberts was on the diggings at Friars Creek near Kyneton at the time of the robbery. One of the outcomes of this testimony is that a man named John Smith, who claimed to be with Roberts at the diggings, was charged with perjury for his evidence. If there was any doubt, the jury didn't dwell long on it. Within 15 minutes, they found all 4 men guilty. On the 28th of May, sentence was handed down. The men were to be kept at hard labour on the colony's roads for a period of 15 years, and the first 3 years to be worked in irons. On the 15th of June, 1852, another of the marauders was identified by Jasmin. Edward Wilson was remanded in custody. He was tried along with Stephen Fox and William Smith at Geelong on the 28th of June. Davis claimed that Fox was the man who stood guard over him, pointing a pistol with an octagonal barrel at him for half an hour. Fox's lawyer pointed out that Davis had also claimed it was Morgan who had guarded him. When Jasmin was giving evidence that he recognised Wilson as being in the cabin, he was challenged that he had identified a man named Lloyd as one of the gang, only saying he was not certain after it was proved that Lloyd was in jail on the night of the raid. The jury found Fox guilty, but acquitted the other 2. Wilson was free to go, but Smith was arrested as a runaway convict. Fox was given the identical penalty as the other 4 found guilty earlier. Meanwhile, John Smith, who had been charged with perjury for saying he was with Roberts at the diggings when the Nelson was plundered, was discharged in mid-July. If Smith did not commit perjury, then Roberts was with him, and was innocent. Roberts was released, but was soon back in jail for another crime. On the 7th of October 1852, Edward Wilson, who had been acquitted in June, and William Barnes were charged with theft from a James of Britain. On the 17th of December 1852, another suspected pirate, Jeremiah Clark, was sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment for vagrancy. If he was one of the gang, he had nothing to show for it. Other men were suspected of involvement, but never brought to trial, including James Grimes and John Hutchinson. The Nelson struck rocks in the English Channel at 7 stones on the 7th of October 1870 and sank with the loss of the captain and 2 crew. The figurehead was recovered in 2004 and sold at auction. Captain Henry Draper worked as a pilot for ships entering the Melbourne docks from 1853 until failing eyesight caused him to stop in 1889. He eventually became totally blind, but continued to work as an examiner in pilotage for masters and new pilots until his death on the 27th of March 1901. As for the gold, that was never found. Some £2,000 worth of money was found on those convicted of the robbery and used as recompense. A rumour, apparently well founded, said that the gold was sold to a respectable Melbourne storekeeper who moonlighted as a notorious fence for stolen property. He paid the pirates 30 shillings an ounce for the gold. He was said to have sold up, boarded a ship, and left for overseas. It was also alleged that the fence may have been a St Kilda publican named John Milton Dascombe, who died in London on the 27th of February 1868, aged 43. In 2021 Australian dollars, the haul was worth almost $18.5 million.